Welcome in everyone to the Fordham Sports Analytics Roundup. I am your host, Chris Orlando. Today we are here with Tom Bliss, Manager of Football Ops and Data Scientist at the NFL. Tom, how you doing?
I'm doing excellent. How are you doing, Chris?
Doing well. Thanks for asking. If you want to go a little more on your background, how you got into the football analytics space and just your experience working with the NFL.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I've been at the NFL for about 3 years now. I started in February of 2020. I, I went to graduate school here in the city as well at Columbia, where I studied data science. Um, did that for a year, did an internship at the NFL, and did well enough to be invited back to work full time. And I've been there ever since. Um, my role involves looking at using data to answer questions related to game quality, officiating, player health and safety, pace of play, and all that sort of stuff. Spend most of my day coding in R, doing a little bit in Python as well, visualizing, modeling, kind of doing a little bit of everything as questions come up from different departments, from different people within the NFL building, and there may be different sort of methodologies that are best to answer certain questions. So, yeah, just grew up very big math person, also loved football, and I was able to end up at the NFL, not really know anyone, just applying for an internship, and here I am today.
That's all really cool stuff. Again, working for the NFL as a data scientist. And I didn't realize like you were involved in like player safety and other aspects of,
Oh yeah.
different projects that they have at the NFL. So that's all some really cool stuff. But first I want to get your thoughts. We had the Super Bowl just passed a couple weeks ago. I think it's been 2 weeks now. So what are your thoughts on like just some of what went on during the Super Bowl? What are your takeaways from both the Eagles and the Chiefs and just the trends that teams are taking into?
Yeah, I thought it was exciting, and obviously it's great when we get 2 1 seeds, definitely the two best, like the teams that had the best records throughout the entirety of the season. So that's always pretty exciting. I thought the game was very great. I mean, obviously a lot of lead changes, a lot of suspense. It was sort of unclear who would win up until the very end. I think, yeah, we at the league, we kind of are looking for that sort of stuff, and competitiveness. It was high scoring. It was definitely, we saw the Eagles go for it on fourth down a few times, which obviously from a data science standpoint, it's cool to see that when teams are making decisions that are a little bit more aggressive, as a lot of the football math has suggested teams to do. And yeah, obviously both quarterbacks performed extremely well. It was a very fun offensive game. So overall, I thought it was great. It was fun.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We got a great game. Obviously we got that call in the end that no one really wanted to see, regardless of what team you're rooting for. So, what are you going to do about that? But, going more into, your experience working with the NFL, obviously we're moving more into the offseason. What kind of projects do you see yourself working on as the season concluded? We had a lot of, again, you mentioned player safety. Is there any more research that you guys would be going into, especially after someone like Tua's injury earlier on in the year, or just any kind of projects as a whole?
Yeah, so I think at the NFL league office, and this is similar to a lot of NFL buildings, but it's NFL clubs, which it's probably more extreme at the clubs than in the league office, but definitely it's true in the league office. But we kind of have the busyness, and what you're working on is incredibly dependent on time of year, which is probably different than some other like data science jobs. So in season, a lot of what I'm doing is working on, for example, really quick questions or ad hoc questions. Like I remember it was the first week 1 of 2020. I use this as an example because that was the first week, like NFL season. I was here. I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was a lot of missed field goals, and people were wondering, is there something going on with the COVID and less practice and missed field goals? So we might be answering a question like during the season, something like, let's look at how unusual it is to have this sort of flurry of missed field goals in a given week. And figure out if that's a trend, if that's something we can expect, or if that's just totally random. And that's kind of what it looks like in season, and also just pulling stuff and working with different parts of the building to just give them weekly reports, such as like game quality, or like for potentially for like international, like what international players are playing, stuff like that. Once we hit the off season, which obviously happened about a week ago, for us, we really get started on a few things. I mean, one, which sort of everyone knows about, is the Big Data Bowl. We're involved in. We have to set up the event, which is taking place next week in Indianapolis, so that should be very fun. As well as collecting all the submissions, distributing them to the judges, working with Kaggle to make sure everything goes smoothly in terms of assigning the winners. So that's a big part of the off season, at least the early part, February and March. But the really sort of big thing that I'm doing right now is the competition committee. And as you probably know, competition committee, that's where rules and decisions are made that will affect the following season. And it takes place at the meetings take place before combine, at combine, and then there's some follow-ups. But essentially we're gonna have to supply information. Coaches might be asking, like, and examples of some people on the competition committee include Mike Vrabel, Ron Rivera, Stephen Jones. They all meet and discuss and ask questions like what happened this year. And one big question that we're trying to answer is the points per game in the NFL decreased by about 3 for this season, which is pretty interesting. We've always sort of been on an upward trend. I guess 2020 was a little bit higher than normal, and probably that had to do with there not really being home advantage. So away teams and home teams were kind of scoring about the same amount, which contributed to just more scoring in general, because there was less like away team delay of games, false starts, and other things that might deter scoring. But generally we've been trending upward, and this year we had sort of a blip. So probably the biggest thing that we're working on in terms of competition committee is where the points go. So that's a big thing. Additionally, where rule changes will come up. For example, last year overtime got changed, and we're not sure exactly what we'll be looking at this year, but things like that we'll be working on and figuring out ways to estimate what the effect of the rule change will be on competitiveness, on officiating, on pace of play, on player health and safety. Like, for example, in overtime, we could have the most fair overtime, but if it adds 50 additional plays, that makes the game too long potentially, and also that's 50 more plays in which players can get hurt, which is also something we don't want. And if there might be an effect later in the game, that's not something we've researched, but just something that we might consider. So once we sort of get through this initial time of busyness, which is going on from probably now until end of March, it'll calm down from April to August, in which we'll work on some long-term projects, such as updating our models. Like, for example, last off season, I built a win probability model for our internal use. Actually, when I was an intern, but last off season, I spent a decent amount of time updating it with more data, using slightly different techniques to try to see if we can get it a little bit more accurate. So that's kind of what that part of the off season looks, just long-term projects that don't necessarily have, like, we don't need a new win probability model July 1st, 2023, but it's something that we'd like to have for the season. So when we get questions that we want to answer with win probability, we're equipped to do so. So yeah, it's kind of our busy season, but we're doing some really cool stuff too. So that's always fun.
I was gonna say, you brought up some really cool topics. Depending, you have the win probability. Obviously, you put some stuff out about win percentage. We'll get back to that in a couple moments, but just want to get your thoughts. Obviously, you mentioned the topic of just like the trends of scoring within the league. You could attest some of that too. Just a lot of quarterback injuries potentially. you had like, I think like over half the league started like a different quarterback this year. So
Yeah.
that could just
So
be a little bit of a player safety issue. Also a factor in, you did mention that the COVID kind of played into it, because it seems like when that crowd is involved, the home field advantage seems like they get a little boost on the defensive end. So, I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, no, definitely. And well, last year I think we pretty much had full stands basically everywhere. Obviously COVID was real. I'm not entirely sure actually. I don't know either way whether that might have affected attendance in some stadiums. But uh, the like that obviously might have something to do with it, especially like comparing now to 2020. Like they were very different. We had completely full unrestricted fans this year, so that's part of it. And yeah, and then you brought up a really good point with the quarterbacks. So this year we had, I think, 69 starting quarterbacks, which I think is the as far like we only have data. Starts were only started being recorded in 2001, but we would believe that has to be the largest number of starting quarterbacks in NFL history. And even when you take into account the 17th game, it remains so. There isn't really one that, like, if you project forward, there isn't really any other year that gets to that high. So yeah, and that has to do with a lot of things, including like a poor quarterback play. If a quarterback isn't playing well, he's more likely to potentially just be replaced by the backup, whether or not there's an injury. So that very well could be. I think another thing that we saw is there was a lot more maybe conservative defense, which encouraged more rushing as opposed to passing. In the past, like this year was the most efficient year for in terms of yards per rush in NFL history. I think it was an average of 4.5 yards per rush. A lot of that has to do with quarterbacks, namely like Justin Fields and some others that just really had great years running the football. But if you run the football more, typically like that means you're throwing less deep passes, which would mean you're less likely to score. And there also could be an effect where if you're running the ball more, there's going to be less plays per game, because a 0-yard rush will be the same effect as an incomplete pass in terms of yards gained, but a 0-yard rush will probably remove almost a minute off the clock, where an incomplete pass will remove 5 seconds off the clock. So that also is a big thing with just more rushing, more successful rushing, more defenses encouraging teams to rush and discouraging passing. Based on just playing deeper coverage, that I think definitely ties to the 3 points that we lost. But yeah, we're still in the midst of doing a lot of research on this topic, and yeah, I think it's fascinating, and it's interesting to see what we can expect in future years in terms of scoring. If this is a blip, or if teams will continue to employ these strategies and continue to have success on the defensive end.
Absolutely. Yeah. You brought up, the rushing efficiency being so good. You could see, obviously, there's been a trend of teams not just necessarily wanting to pay a big time running back like a Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey. We obviously saw Christian McCaffrey got traded to the 49ers, but you see teams like the Eagles where they kind of don't spend a lot of cap space on necessarily the running back, but they spend a lot of draft capital, a lot of salary cap on offensive linemen, and using less salary cap on the quarterback and getting good receivers, and just like the approach that they've had. So definitely added some success, and kind of the reason why they went to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
But yeah, so kind of now want to go more into what your perspective is on just like how coaching kind of affects win probability. I know you mentioned you're doing a little bit there. Kind of want to bring up, I guess, through one of your recent studies of how NFL coaches use timeouts, and maybe how that affects some of the trends. Like if you're saying, oh, well, this team's running the ball more at the beginning of the quarters, or towards the middle of the quarters, and then the end of the quarters, obviously they're passing more. Some coaches are using those timeouts more effectively, and they're able to run the ball, at certain points during those last 2 minutes. So go in more detail into how some coaches are approaching using timeouts.
Yeah. So that's something that it's a project I maybe did maybe a year ago, and I continue to update it. It's pretty fun. Yeah. So essentially, one thing that we looked into was how timeouts are used by team and coach. And for example, there are timeouts that might be used with under 2 minutes and the clock is running. And we can potentially assume that that might be a timeout, and like the timeout is called immediately after the play is over. And then there are timeouts where you're using it to avoid a delay of game, or you just don't like what the coach doesn't like the play, or the quarterback doesn't like the play that was called, and you're making it to prevent the play from being ran. So we looked at whether like I know I think Sumer has done some really good stuff directly tying this to win probability. But what we did was we just visualized what exactly happened, and it's interesting. I think Brandon Staley is sort of the lowest in terms of using timeouts that would be deemed unnecessary, i.e., like to avoid a delay of game in the middle of the first quarter, or just not at a point in the game where you're trying to actually stop the clock, but just to call it. Where I think Josh McDaniels had the most of those timeouts, where uh, they were not like they were in the middle of the first quarter. They weren't really at the end of the game or the end of the quarter. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I off the top of my head, I don't know if there's necessarily I can make a direct tie like, oh, this will these are coaches that rush more or coaches that pass more, but I think it's something that there's definitely a pretty big difference between number one and and the most. Like Josh McDaniels averages around 3 per game, where Brandon Staley averages about 1.5.
It's interesting to see how those coaches approach because sometimes your coach has confidence in saying, oh, well, I have a quarterback like Justin Herbert at the end of those halves, where he could potentially get one last drive in and get some points on the board for the half ends. Whereas like Josh McDaniels, might have more of a conservative approach and just wants to make sure that his defense and his offense are prepared. It's interesting to see how, and you also see Mike McDaniel. I noticed while he, took the league by storm as a coach this year, he definitely seems like he knows what he's doing and has kind of established a good regime there in Miami. But it seemed like he used a lot of those timeouts unnecessarily at the end of in the middle of those quarters. And it's interesting to see how, I guess, the trend will be moving forward with
Yeah,
those coaches.
I'm looking at this table now again, and I'm noticing something that is interesting. There are we have of the top 6, 5 of them were in their first year, where it's of the top 6, Josh McDaniels, Mike McDaniel, Jeff Saturday, Kevin O'Connell, and Nathaniel Hackett all were in their first year this past year. So potentially there might be something to the fact that if you're a coach and Andy Reid is toward the bottom, and he's obviously had more experience, I guess.
Vrabel's down there too.
Vrabel, yeah. So coaches that maybe are new and are still getting used to maybe knowing when to call timeout, or just being more prepared in these like near delay of game situations, who have more experience being there. Maybe that's what maybe that's something that we can highlight here as interesting, and potentially a link of those top coaches.
For sure. I'm interested to see how you guys approach, more data as trends move towards more coaches being hired, especially, like I think we had like 5 or 6 coaching changes this year so far.
Yeah.
Interesting. And a lot of coordinators too, may I add. But so now moving more into the off season, kind of want to get your thoughts on, as we're approaching the NFL draft, what kind of prospects have you've been watching? The Hula Bowl, the Shrine Bowl, obviously the Senior Bowl, and then as well as what kind of approaches do you think the teams such as like the Eagles, for example, they traded a high overall draft pick to draft a guy, or to trade for a guy like AJ Brown, who would definitely put their offense over the top, even though the Titans couldn't necessarily pay him, and the Eagles could with having a quarterback under contract on his rookie deal, as well as in comparison to the Bengals, where you have guys like Joe Burrow still on his rookie contract, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, building from the ground up. What kind of difference do you see within the trend of those two teams, and like what do you think is a preference, at least through the league, as trends move towards there?
Yeah, so I think that that's really interesting. I think, yeah, I'll start by talking about that the Eagles trade, and maybe I might actually compare the Eagles to the Titans because they were sort of on the opposite sides of that trade. Where so the Eagles, they traded a first round pick, I think it was like 15 or 16, to the Titans to get AJ Brown, and the Titans with that pick took Treylon Burks. So it's an interesting question that kind of the both teams were sort of balancing where, and obviously there's part of it is how both teams individually felt Treylon Burks, how strong of a player Treylon Burks was coming out. But I think it's an interesting sort of process where on one side you have to pay your, like both teams are sort of could use the first round pick, but you could use the first round, if you're the Eagles, use the first round pick and potentially take AJ Brown, who you have a lot more certainty in terms of how strong of a player he is. But you're going to pay in cap, like he costs significantly more than Treylon Burks, who obviously as a rookie, he's on the rookie contract for the next 4 or 5 years, depending on whether they exercise his option. But it's an interesting question whether it's kind of like you obviously if in a perfect world you want to pay, like if you're the team you want to save it cap space while also getting a player you're certain is good, but it's difficult because if you go with Burks, AJ Brown was a rookie and he had a great rookie year, and Burks potentially he could be have a career that AJ Brown had, but you're kind of paying for the certainty and you're also paying for a player is. I think also there might have been something to the fact that I think Jalen Hurts and him knew each other, and potentially that, I don't know if that tied, but you're paying for something that will be good, and that AJ Brown has had success in the league versus Treylon Burks, who it's hard to say. So yeah, I think I think all of it is really interesting. I'm not. I don't know if I would say like which methodology is necessarily better. I think there isn't really anything that I've seen that's clear to show okay, like this is the way to go versus this. I just think it's interesting, and like I think that it's good in the sense that there isn't an obvious path forward. I think that's what makes the NFL offseason interesting, because it's you never know whether or not like going for a certain player that costs money is better than going for a rookie who could be as good, but maybe won't be as good, but is a lot cheaper.
For sure. And you see teams nowadays, obviously Justin Jefferson, one example you brought up. The Bills traded their 22nd overall pick for Stephon Diggs, as you mentioned, a certainty at the position. Meanwhile, the Vikings took a later round receiver in the first round and drafting Justin Jefferson. And while Jefferson at the time wasn't necessarily the prospect that you have guys like Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Julio Jones, AJ Green, more to mention. But those guys are more of a certainty in their draft capital criteria. But as you move later on, again, AJ Brown was a later round for second round pick, I believe. T. Higgins is a second round pick. So these guys, you could still get some value as long as you believe in the process. And especially, when you get those guys later on, you don't have to pay them nearly as much as the top end guys. But it's interesting definitely to see how, these teams approach getting that one extra piece, one extra weapon, and trading potentially a cap hit, $25 million to $30 million, especially with the receiver contracts going up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and that's another good example of a receiver trade where the team that made the trade ended up taking a receiver themselves. And in that case, and then maybe we have to wait down the line to see how well it goes for the Titans in the future. But I mean, I think in that case, it seems like both the Vikings and the Bills seem to get ended up with top receivers, and seemed like a good trade for both sides.
For sure. And moving towards the draft this year, we see guys a lot of the top end quarterbacks, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, we got Will Levis, Anthony Richardson. So we got a little top heavy quarterback class, maybe not as strong as years past in comparison, but we don't see those top end receivers in comparison this year. So we could see kind of a correlation, a lot of later round receivers potentially, focus more on defensive players. It seems like interior offensive linemen, edge rushers, those kind of dominate this kind of draft. And as the draft moves on, we'll see some receivers drafted in the later rounds. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, on what I think, like how I think the draft will play out.
Yeah, how do you think in comparison to years past, how move
Yeah,
forward?
yeah, it's hard for me to say. I'll be honest. I don't like definitely this time of year, especially. I'm not necessarily following like the mock drafts super closely. I do think it's always fun when there are a lot of quarterbacks at the top of the draft. So I think that'll be exciting. I think obviously last year, I think there was only one first round quarterback taken, and although there were a lot of quarterbacks taken in the later rounds, so I think it should be fun in that sense. And yeah, like there are a lot of teams that could potentially take a quarterback at the first few picks too, and maybe we might see some interesting trades. So yeah, I guess I'm not. I wouldn't say I would be able to make a strong case on how I think it'll play out compared to past drafts, but I think it should be interesting with the quarterbacks and potentially some trades between teams to move up.
Absolutely, I agree. So now moving towards some of the other studies that you've had, to mention your win probability or win percentage by point differential and point per game. And this is interesting to see because obviously we saw in the playoffs the Chargers blow a significant lead to the Jaguars, and kind of how teams approach running the ball and towards the end of quarters and kind of winding down the clock, and just like how teams approach clock management, especially when they're up or when they're down. Just want to get your thoughts on some of the trends that you analyze within that graph and some of the studies that you've done so far within that project.
Yeah, no, I mean, we kind of just put this together just for fun. I thought it was really interesting, and yeah, like obviously we also, in addition to that historic that comeback in the playoffs, there was also a Vikings Colts comeback, which was the largest in NFL history. So it's always really cool to see when that happens. But yeah, I think it's interesting that it kind of, I mean, I guess we've never seen a 25 plus comeback in the fourth quarter, or at least since 2011. I'm not sure if historically, I don't think we have seen that historically. I definitely think there are some large second half comebacks, as we saw with that 33-point comeback, as well as the 27-point comeback in the wild card round. I think it's also interesting that obviously late in games, when you have 3 scores, you're also feeling pretty solid as well. It certainly makes sense, and also as you get later and later in the game, like if you have any lead in the final 3 minutes, you win about 80% of the time, which is cool. And obviously this doesn't take into account who has possession. Like I think if you have a 1-point lead with 3 minutes left and the opponent has the ball on your 20, all right, that's not necessarily that probably isn't. You probably actually have below 50% win probability, but just generally speaking, you're like having a lead late of that many is good. So I thought it was pretty cool to sort of see how this played out.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you see these teams, obviously the Vikings, I forgot to mention, they had that 33-point comeback. Obviously the Colts are being coached by an interim head coach in Jeff Saturday, who doesn't necessarily have too much background or coaching experience, versus obviously Kevin O'Connell has been a coordinator before, but he's also a first-year coach. So it's interesting to see, as we mentioned before, the clock management, time management, timeout management. Interesting to see how, I guess, that more prevent defense is more vulnerable to a team like the Vikings, who, while they might be stagnant it seemed like at points in the year so far, they had that big spark at the end. So definitely interesting to see there. And before we wrap up here, we got a little time left on the Zoom. just want to get your thoughts and advice for people potentially. We usually ask our guest speakers is, what kind of advice for you? You obviously mentioned that you studied data science at Columbia, but it seems like data visualization programming languages are becoming more of just a not necessarily a class thing, but more just doing stuff on your own, doing projects on your own. What advice do you have towards people getting into the industry, getting into the space, whether it might be sports related or not, like just getting familiarized with some of the content, data visualization, again, programming languages?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think, obviously I went a grad school path, but I think there are so many ways to break into the industry, and I don't think grad school is necessary. I think that's just maybe one of the ways. I think one really cool thing that I would suggest anyone to take advantage, especially if you're interested in sports, is to look at in NFL, the NFL verse. There's a lot of really great, free, easy to access data. And they have a great website that sort of explains how to get it and what there is. So I would highly recommend that as a place to start. And I know, and I'm not as familiar with it because I don't necessarily use it as much, but I know there's other stuff for NBA and NHL. I think I know there's We Hoop, which I think is women's basketball, which is also great. So I would highly recommend everyone to sort of look into those packages and R and just get started with the data and just play around and learn. I think one thing about data science, and it's kind of true about everything, but I know it's definitely true about data science, is you don't just get better overnight. You don't just say, oh, now I know data science and it's over. I learn new things every day. And I think there's code I wrote a year ago that I look at it now and I say, why would I write that? And then the year before that, there was code that I looked at and I would say, like, this is not how I would want to write it. And every year I feel like I'm improving, which is what I want to be doing. And I think as long as someone sticks to it, they'll get better and better. I think just getting started is probably the biggest hurdle. And I think to potentially get started, what I did was, you want to ask a question that you are personally interested in answering. Like, for example, the timeout thing. Like, how do coaches use timeouts? You could just try to figure something out. Or I did a project on NBA roster optimization. Like, how would you, if you were trying to maximize like, I think I used this ESPN metric called EWA, which was kind of like WAR, it's above replacement. But if you want to if you're curious, how do you do X? What does this mean? I would just try to answer a question that you yourself are interested in and go from there. Go ahead.
No, you're good. I was just rounding up what you were saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think then just try to share it and try to talk about it. And I think when I applied to the NFL internship, it was helpful for me to be able to have some project to talk about and to have projects that I'd worked on to show. So I think that's something that's really important to have.
Absolutely. Again, you're not going to necessarily advance any of your skills without doing stuff that you're interested. So definitely brought up some good points and some good tools that people listening to the podcast could potentially utilize if they want to get more into the space, whether it's sports related or not. So again, thank you again for all your time. You definitely brought up a lot of good points to talk about. And as we approach the NFL offseason, the NFL draft, free agency, it's interesting to see how these teams will approach. And thank you again. If you have any, last words, if you want to talk about real quick.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Thanks for having me. This was a fun conversation. And yeah, feel free to follow me at Data with Bliss on Twitter. And yeah, I'm excited for this off season, excited for the upcoming draft, and then excited for the 2023 season to start up again in September. So it was a fun time at the NFL. So yeah, we're just gonna continue to go through it.
Awesome. Make sure you guys give them a follow at Data with Bliss. You mentioned. Yeah. So make sure you guys tune into that. And thanks again. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you.